Spain's decision to diverge from the European Union's unified stance on Chinese tariffs is not simply a minor diplomatic variation or a fleeting moment of political dissent. It marks a profound strategic realignment with potentially lasting consequences. This move reveals a calculated recognition of the shifting global economic landscape, where traditional Western alliances are increasingly strained, and new centers of power, particularly China, are reshaping the contours of international trade and influence. In choosing not to support the EU's proposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, Spain is making a clear, deliberate statement. It places immense value on its economic relationship with Beijing, and it is prepared to chart a course that prioritizes bilateral pragmatism over bloc-wide orthodoxy. This shift is not born of ideological affinity or diplomatic symbolism. It's grounded in hard economic realities. Spain, like many nations navigating the 21st century economy, understands that prosperity is no longer guaranteed by allegiance alone, but by adaptability, strategic foresight, and global connectivity. The rise of China as a dominant economic force has transformed the dynamics of international trade. For a country like Spain, which is still recovering from past economic challenges and striving to maintain relevance in a competitive European market, aligning more closely with a powerhouse like China is not merely advantageous. It may be essential for long-term survival. By resisting the EU's protectionist impulse, Spain is positioning itself as a vital intermediary between Europe and China. Its strategic geography, with ports linking Atlantic and Mediterranean trade routes, offers it a unique advantage. China's increasing investments in European infrastructure, ranging from green energy initiatives to high-speed rail networks, present tangible opportunities for Spain to bolster its domestic economy while deepening its ties with a global superpower. The implications of these developments extend far beyond isolated sectors. They touch nearly every corner of Spain's economy, from agriculture and energy to technology and manufacturing. Yet the risks are equally substantial. By challenging EU consensus, Spain risks alienating powerful allies such as Germany and France, whose own industries, especially automotive giants like Volkswagen, BMW, and Renault, are directly threatened by Chinese competition. These countries, long accustomed to steering EU economic policy, may perceive Spain's defection as a weakening of the bloc's collective negotiating strength. Should this dissent inspire other member states to follow suit, the EU could find itself facing internal fragmentation, with individual countries competing against one another for favorable treatment from Beijing, undermining the very foundation of European economic solidarity. On the other hand, if Spain's gamble succeeds, if it secures deeper Chinese investment, protects key industries, and avoids the worst of trade retaliation, it could redefine the EU's approach to external trade relations. Spain might then emerge as a model for a more flexible, nation-led diplomacy, where economic necessity dictates policy more than ideological alignment. In such a scenario, the EU would be forced to reevaluate its stance toward China, perhaps softening its position in favor of more nuanced, pragmatic engagement. Failing to adapt could mean losing out on a share of the world's fastest-growing markets. Domestically, however, Spain's pivot is not without political cost. The nation's agricultural sector, heavily reliant on exports to China, stands on precarious ground. Spanish pork, olive oil, wine, fruits, and vegetables enjoy strong demand among China's burgeoning middle class. Any retaliatory tariffs from Beijing could devastate rural regions, where farming remains the economic backbone, causing supply chain disruptions and job losses. The ripple effect would not end at the farm gate. Logistics companies, exporters, and small businesses intertwined with these supply chains would also suffer, amplifying economic pain and fueling political unrest. Moreover, the broader public may begin to question the wisdom of this new direction. Spaniards who work in or depend on vulnerable sectors may view their government's defiance of the EU as reckless, particularly if it results in economic setbacks or diplomatic isolation. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez could come under increasing pressure from opposition parties and disillusioned voters who argue that he is jeopardizing national stability and European unity for speculative gains. As trade tensions escalate, the government's ability to manage both domestic discontent and international fallout will be tested. Still, beneath these risks lies a deeper, more structural transformation. Spain's actions reflect a world in flux, where no single power or alliance can dictate terms unilaterally. Economic influence is no longer the exclusive domain of Western institutions or traditional powers. It is dispersed across a network of rising states and shifting allegiances. Countries like Spain, which historically followed the lead of larger EU economies, are now reassessing their roles, asserting agency, and forging independent paths in the global marketplace. This recalibration is not unique to Spain. It mirrors a wider reckoning taking place across Europe and beyond, as nations confront the limitations of collective action in an increasingly multipolar world. Should Spain's maneuver prove fruitful, it could mark the beginning of a broader transformation in Europe's relationship with China. Other EU countries may start to explore similar recalibrations of their trade policies, weighing the benefits of deeper ties with Beijing against the political cost of breaking with EU consensus. The question becomes whether this moment is an anomaly, or the first step toward a more fragmented, flexible, and economically driven European foreign policy. The EU may ultimately find itself at a crossroads, forced to choose between a rigid, unified front that risks economic stagnation and a more dynamic, albeit disjointed, approach that embraces diversity of strategy. And yet the stakes are rising quickly. China, historically adept at leveraging its economic muscle in response to foreign pressure, will not remain passive in the face of tariffs. If the EU proceeds with punitive measures against Chinese electric vehicles, Beijing is almost certain to retaliate by targeting key European exports. Luxury brands, for example, names like LVMH, Hermes, and Gucci could be hit hard. These companies depend heavily on Chinese consumers, who accounted for nearly 30% of global luxury spending in 2023. Any disruption to this market could compel European firms to reassess their global business strategies and consider shifting operations or rebalancing supply chains. The technology sector is another high-risk area. Europe exports billions of euros worth of advanced machinery and components to China. This trade not only supports high-skilled jobs across the continent, but also underpins innovation and competitiveness in key industries. A trade war could choke these flows, damaging both economies and accelerating China's already vigorous push for technological self-reliance. With China being the EU's second-largest trading partner, any sustained conflict could leave lasting scars across multiple sectors. Germany's hesitation toward these tariffs underscores the internal tensions within the EU. The country's auto manufacturers have deep and enduring relationships with China. Volkswagen, for example, sold more than 3.5 million vehicles in China in 2023, almost 40% of its total global sales. Similar figures hold for BMW and Mercedes-Benz. These companies have invested heavily in Chinese production and research facilities, making them particularly vulnerable to any downturn in trade relations. Their influence in Berlin, and by extension in Brussels, may ultimately shape the EU's next moves. All of this points to a fundamental reality. The world of global trade has grown too complex, too intertwined, and too fast-moving for rigid policy frameworks. Spain's bold step away from the EU's consensus is a reflection of that complexity, a recognition that economic diplomacy now requires not only courage, but a clear-eyed understanding of national interest, strategic leverage, and long-term vision. Whether this marks the beginning of a new chapter in European foreign policy or a cautionary tale of economic overreach remains to be seen. But one thing is undeniable: Spain has set a precedent that others will watch closely. In doing so, it has thrust itself into the center of one of the most consequential debates of our time: how to balance sovereignty, solidarity, and survival in an era of profound global transformation. Losing access to China's market would be a severe blow to Germany's economy, given its heavy dependence on automotive exports and deep trade ties. In contrast, France and Italy are far less reliant on China and have focused more on shielding their domestic markets. French President Emmanuel Macron has been particularly outspoken about the need for protective tariffs, arguing that Europe must defend its workers against unfair competition. In a recent speech, Macron warned that Europe cannot allow its industries to be dismantled by Chinese subsidies. This fundamental difference in perspective is deepening divisions within the European Union. Germany, whose economic success is closely tied to China, is reluctant to inflame tensions. Meanwhile, countries like France and Italy, which have experienced the brunt of Chinese competition, are pushing aggressively for stronger trade protections. Spain's unexpected move to oppose the EU's proposed tariffs has further revealed just how fragmented the bloc has become. Each nation is wrestling with its own economic priorities, and forging a unified policy on China is becoming increasingly difficult. Some EU countries like Germany and Spain prioritize maintaining strong economic ties with China. Others, particularly France and Italy, are calling for defensive measures to level the playing field. But this isn't only about trade, it's a political turning point. Europe is at a crossroads. Some member states advocate for deeper EU integration and collective action, while others are leaning toward a more nationalistic, flexible approach. As The Economist recently noted, China is driving a wedge between EU members, a wedge that could reshape the continent's geopolitical future. At the core of this rift is trade. In 2023, China's trade surplus with the European Union reached an extraordinary $400 billion. This imbalance stems from Europe's heavy importation of Chinese goods, electronics, machinery, electric vehicles, without a reciprocal level of exports. This growing trade deficit is not just an economic issue, it's a strategic one. It gives China increased leverage in any negotiation, and the more dependent Europe becomes on Chinese imports, the more power China wields over European economies. The real risk lies in dependency. If Europe continues to rely on low-cost Chinese products, what happens when China decides to exert pressure? The EU could find itself in a compromised position with limited options. Spain's refusal to support the tariff plan underscores this tension. As the Eurozone's fourth-largest economy, Spain sees China as a vital partner and is far less alarmed by the trade imbalance than France or Italy. Madrid believes that maintaining access to Chinese markets and investment outweighs the risks posed by the surplus. Economists like Paul Donovan from UBS have cautioned China's leverage over Europe is far greater than most policymakers realize. Without coordinated action, this influence could reach a tipping point, leaving Europe vulnerable to strategic and economic coercion. The impact is already global. Supply chains from Africa to Southeast Asia are feeling the effects. And as these tensions escalate, they're pulling in other major powers. The United States, for instance, is closely monitoring Europe's response as it pursues its own trade confrontation with China. A divided Europe weakens the West's collective stance, making it harder to counterbalance Beijing's ambitions. Beyond trade, China is rapidly expanding its Belt and Road Initiative, drawing in new economic partners across Africa, South America, and Asia. If Europe fails to present a cohesive front, it risks isolating itself while China forges ahead with alternative alliances. The global economic landscape is shifting fast, and Spain's decision may well shape how Europe fits into that new order. So what exactly is motivating Spain? Is this simply an economic calculation, or is something deeper at play? By rejecting the EU's tariff proposal, Spain is signaling its intent to act as a mediator, positioning itself as a bridge between Europe and China. Trade with China has become increasingly important to Spain. In 2023, China became Spain's third-largest trading partner, and Spanish exports to China rose by over 15%, led by sectors like machinery, agriculture, and pharmaceuticals. But Spain's strategy goes beyond exports. Chinese companies have invested heavily in the Spanish economy, pouring over $5 billion into key sectors such as technology, infrastructure, and renewable energy in 2023 alone. These investments are crucial for Spain's long-term development and energy transition goals. The Spanish government sees value in pursuing a softer, more pragmatic approach with Beijing, one that maintains trade and investment flows while allowing Madrid to play a more influential role in shaping EU policy. This is a calculated move. Spain is carefully positioning itself as a diplomatic player, balancing Europe's calls for fair competition with its own desire for continued Chinese engagement. It's a difficult tightrope to walk, but one that could ultimately elevate Spain's status within the EU. As the EU prepares to vote on the proposed tariffs, Spain's opposition has already thrown the outcome into uncertainty. Germany, long hesitant about the move, may align with Spain. If the vote fails, it could send a message to Beijing that Europe is not united, weakening the EU's leverage in future negotiations. On the other hand, if the tariffs pass, dissenting countries like Spain could face economic retaliation from China, risking their own trade and investment relationships. This isn't just another policy debate, it's a moment of real consequence. Spain's stance could alter the balance of power between Europe and China. As trade tensions escalate, Spain is making a bold bet that could reshape both its national economy and the EU's broader strategy. Will this decision foster new diplomatic alignments or deepen divisions within the European Union? That remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, the world is watching closely.